Thank you for coming. My name is Mark Sweeney, and Dave and I are here from Whiteman, Osterman, and Hanna to talk to you about the new seeker forms that have come out. They're not effective yet. DEC is still working out the kinks on things, but we'll give you a good primer on them so that when they are effective, hopefully you'll be familiar with them and can use them effectively. Just as a show of hands, has anyone, I assume everyone here has had some experience with seeker. If you raise your hand, if you have not had any experience with seeker, if you have not. Okay, so then we're going to start basically, and that's a good way to start our program today, is just a reminder of what these forms are utilized for. These forms are part of the seeker review process, the State Environmental Quality Review Act, which is a legal process that is required for all boards that are making decisions to fund or approve a project or action that has to be completed before that can occur. So the purpose of the statute is to make sure every board that's making a decision to fund or approve a project considers the environmental consequences of each action and builds that into their decision-making process. So typically, the local agency, the planning board or zoning board hearing an action, will be the lead agency that carries out the seeker process. On a larger project, there may be other involved agencies, such as state agencies, DEC, for wetlands, or SHPO consultations that are necessary, or things like that that can be required. And the general rule is no permits or approvals can be issued until the seeker process is completed. The authority for the State Environmental Quality Review is found in the Environmental Conservation Law, Article 8. That statute sets out the basic standards for the seeker review process, and then there's more detailed regulations put forth by DEC in Part 617 of the New York Code's Rules and Regulations. And that's really the seeker regs that everybody holds on to and has in binders like this that they keep by their desk when they're hearing projects. There's also other helpful documents that you can go to. On the DEC website, there's a whole slew of guidance documents that are relevant to seeker reviews, including the seeker handbook. And right now, there's a seeker handbook for the current forms that are there. There's a new one that's being developed for each of the new forms. Only the short form workbook is ready at this point. We're still waiting on the workbook for the full EAF. The Seeker Cookbook, Citizen's Guide, and Local Officials Guide to Seeker are all very good and useful and thorough seeker materials to use. And also a treatise called Environmental Impact Review in New York, which is a substantial 2-volume edition that's updated constantly with all kinds of case law relevant to the basic rules of seeker and all the minutiae and the little nit details that cause all of you so much angst when projects come before you. Seeker applies, as we said, to any public body, not just planning boards and zoning boards, that has jurisdiction by law to fund, approve, or directly undertake an action. An action is a defined term as a project or other activity in the regulations. As you can see, there are many different public bodies that this applies to, and this is not an exhaustive list, it's just representative. And the actions include zoning amendments, site plans, special use permits, zoning variances of certain degrees, subdivision approvals, agreements related to projects, and even comprehensive plans and things like that. So you have site-specific projects and you have area-wide actions that a board may undertake as well. The important thing to remember is that when an action or a board's action is reviewed in court, compliance with seeker must be two things, substantive and procedural. There's very strict review of whether the procedures of seeker have been followed, and if they haven't, an action will be invalidated. The substantive test, there's a little bit more of a rule of reason or deference to a board, and basically it requires that the board take a hard look at the potential environmental impacts of an action. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean you have to look at every single possible environmental impact under the sun. It has to be, has a reasonable effort been made to identify those impacts, and then a hard look taken for each of the identified impacts, and then is there a written, reasoned elaboration of the decision why you decided the way you did at the end of the day. So that's the test a court is going to look at. So following those tenets will put you in a position to have your decisions upheld as you go forward. And for procedural compliance, either staff or attorneys that help you can be key resources for that procedural compliance. All right, the seeker flow chart. It's probably harder to see but it is very helpful. This is available in the seeker workbooks and cookbooks. and it gives you a basic process overview of how seeker works. When someone comes and puts an application in your office, or the town board says we want to undertake a comprehensive plan review, zoning law update, or anything of that nature, basically what it says is your first decision is this subject to seeker? And you have to make that initial decision before you do anything. And if it is subject to seeker, then you have to take several steps along the way before you can ultimately make a decision on whether or not there's a significant environmental impact. So the first thing is it subject? Then you have to classify the action, and we'll talk more about that a little later with the forms. And there's a type 1 action, which is basically a type of action that's believed to possibly have a significant adverse environmental impact. And then unlisted actions, which are just as they say, they're unlisted, because all of the type 1s are listed in the seeker regs. And then type 2, which means not subject to seeker. So once you classify that action, you know, one, the applicant will then know what type of EAF needs to be used. They know what type of information to give to you in order to make that decision. And then also you go to the next step of, okay, who's going to be the lead agency? And if it's just a planning board review, a site plan review, or anything like that, then you're in a position to know that, okay, we'll do this individually. If other agencies are involved, then basically what has to happen is you send out a notice saying we have this project, we want to conduct a review, and we're asking to be lead agency. If you have an objection, please tell us. And then from there you go, once that happens and the lead agency is established, then you can start analyzing the EAF forms and trying to make a determination and consideration of the environmental factors. But that little step, that process has to occur before you can do that. So as we said, the basic process here is the action subject to seeker, classify it, and then once it's classified and you can start the review, start preparing the EAF. Part 1 is usually done by the applicant, providing you information about the project that they're doing. The lead agency is selected, and then once the lead agency is there, you're going to go through and figure through parts 2 and 3 for the full EAF and part 2 for the short in order to render your determination of significance. And as you well know, the positive declaration means applicant go prepare an environmental impact statement. Negative declaration means there's no potential adverse environmental impacts, and that ends the seeker review process for that action. And you can go forward applying your town standards for site plan or special use permit or whatever it may be. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dave to talk about the seeker forms, and I'll be back later to talk about the long form.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Dave Everett. As Mark had mentioned, we're partners with Whiteman, Osterman, and Hanna in Albany, New York. We are partners in the Land Use and Environmental Practice Group. Between us, we have over 40 years of experience representing municipal boards, zoning boards, planning boards, town boards on a variety of land use projects and environmental projects. We've represented applicants as well before the boards, as well as citizens. I'm also a member of the Planning Federation, and I'm chairman of the Town of Chatham Zoning Board of Appeals. And there are some members from our board here today, and you can identify them because they're reaching for their no-dos right now, especially when I'm starting to speak. But before I get into talking about the new seeker forms, I just wanted to run over with you the handouts and just make sure everybody has a handout. The first handout is basically the PowerPoint presentation we're giving today. And then we also have a copy of the new EAF short form from DEC with the big mark across it saying not effective until April 1st, 2013, which is very important. If you don't take away anything today, please take away that, which is it's not effective until April 1st. And then we also have the third handout is the full EAF from DEC. I also have some other documents which I'll hold up and discuss as we go through. But Mark basically went through sort of the very beginnings of the seeker process. I'm going to talk about the EAF forms in general to give you a little bit of background about them, and then talk about the new short EAF form that DEC has adopted. And then Mark's going to come back and take over and talk about the full EAF form. So that's basically how we've had it broken out. Okay, so the next slide up is on seeker forms. This is basically the definition out of the seeker regulations as to what an environmental assessment form is. The seeker regs define it as a form used by an agency to assist it in determining the environmental significance or non-significance of actions A properly completed EAF must contain enough information to describe the proposed action, its location, its purpose, its potential impacts on the environment. And the EAF serve as the initial collection and analysis of information concerning an action's potential environmental effects. They serve to provide the factual and legal basis for the determination of environmental significance. And that last line is really the important line. As you know, the EAFs, they provide the facts about the project, and they provide the legal basis to sustain your decision in court if you're ever challenged in court. So the EAFs are a critical tool in the process, which really can't get overlooked. And we've got a couple slides later on about some cases which have annulled local board decisions because they have failed to properly fill out the EAFs or not use the EAFs at all. Okay, where to find the EAFs? Well, the EAFs are in the SEQRA regulations in Appendix A, B, and C, but they're also available on DEC's website, and that's where most people get them. You just go to the DEC's website, which the web address is here for you, and you can actually fill out the EAF form on DEC's website, so you don't have to print it out and hand write in it. Some people do that, and that's fine, but you can actually just pull it up on the website, and you can type in, fill in each of the boxes and then print it out. And there's a lot of people who have started to do that, and DEC is trying to make that process a lot easier and more web-based in the new EAF forms, and we'll talk all about sort of the web-based concept that DEC is trying to implement with these new forms. The other thing is that local boards should include a blank copy of the EAF with all applications. I mean, most boards do this, but I have seen in the state where some boards don't, and it's just a lot easier. Just when an applicant comes in, you give them, both forms, where you have your clerk or somebody figure out whether you think it's going to be a short form or a long form, and then give them the right form, and that'll start off making sure that you get all the application materials you need as soon as you can. So there's basically three types of EAFs, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. There's the full EAF, which is 14 pages long. It's got a lot of questions to it. It can only be used for type 1 actions. It can also be used for unlisted actions. And with respect to the unlisted actions, you really have to decide if it's a fairly large or complicated unlisted action that may fall just below the thresholds for a type 1 action. You may want to use the full EAF because it gives you a lot more information about the project upon which to base your environmental decision at the end. And it also sustains a challenge to you in court. The more information you have in the record about what you looked at and what conclusions you drew, it's going to be better. The second one is the short EAF. The current form is only a couple of pages long. The new form is basically going to be doubled in size, providing more questions, more information. But the short EAF, as you know, can only be used for unlisted actions only. There's also a visual EAF form. I've got a copy of it up here if anybody wants to see it afterwards. And that's a form that's used when projects are going to have a visual or aesthetic impact. I've seen boards use it mostly for cell tower applications or for mines, that are going to be cutting down large portions of hillsides. They use the visual EAF, and it's a 4-page form that basically talks about the different types of visual impacts, whether the project is seasonal, who's going to see it, how often are they going to see it, from where are they going to see it, those kinds of things. The key to know is that this form is basically being eliminated in the new round. What DEC is doing is they're basically taking most of the questions and comments and stuff in here, and they're moving it into the full EAF form. And then Mark had talked about classifying the action, and the other thing, which I'm sure you all know, is that if your action that you're dealing with is type 2, which means that it's exempt from SEQRA review, there's no EAF obviously required for that. And the DEC regulations have a list of what actions constitute type 2 actions. They're typically the smaller actions that are not going to have or deemed not to have a significant impact on the environment. Lot line adjustments, things that are small like that in nature. Okay, the EAF forms are basically divided into 3 parts, and that's going to stay the same for both the short and the full. Part 1 basically identifies the factual information about the project. Where is it? What is it? Part 2 evaluates the project information to ascertain the probable environmental impacts. And some evaluation may involve the exercise of professional engineering and scientific judgment. As a board, you're going to have to decide whether or not you need a traffic engineer, you need a wetlands consultant to take a look at a particular issue or help you address a particular question in the EAF. And then there are also questions in Part 2 that, as you know, involve subjective determinations or opinions. Whether or not the project is going to have offensive odors, is it going to have an aesthetic impact, those kinds of things. And those concepts remain the same in the new EAF forms. And then the third part is evaluation of the magnitude and the importance of the environmental impacts, and you determine significance there, whether you do a neg deck or you do a pos deck, and that basically is going to stay the same as well. There's tweaks to all of these things, and we'll go over them with you in a little bit more detail. So I just wanted to also run over the general rules, because sometimes I see boards lose sight of these general rules. But the lead agency is the one that's responsible for preparing the EAF. I mean, you're ultimately responsible for what's in that document. Now, Part 1 is completed by the applicant, and that's required under the secret regulations. But if there's material in Part 1 that hasn't been completed that you need, you have to ask the applicant for it, or you've got to prepare it, or you've got to provide it in the EAF. So, you're ultimately responsible for the entire document. I've seen situations where boards let the applicant prepare the entire EAF form, or they let their consultant prepare the entire EAF form, and then they just stick it in the file, and they go ahead and they go and do their neg deck or their pos deck without reviewing it, without seeing whether or not there's any deficiencies in it or whether additional information is required. And that is a big no-no. I know it's easy to do, and a lot of boards rely upon their consultants to do that, but in the end, the courts have said, you can't do that. You're the ones that are ultimately responsible, and in situations where boards have stuck the thing in the file without reviewing it, the courts have annulled their actions. So that's an important thing to take away. The other thing is that the lead agency under SECRA is allowed to ask for assistance in preparing the EAFs or conducting its SECRA review. You're allowed to ask for assistance from other interested and involved agencies. So if you need help, there's a potential historic or archaeological impact, and you need some help, you can ask SHPO, which is the State Historic Preservation Office, which is under the OPRHP, which is the New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation. They'll provide you with a letter analyzing what the potential impacts are. You can ask DEC to come out and delineate wetlands if you need it. And there's a whole host of other agencies that you can ask, and I know that a lot of the boards do that, and that's good to see. The third bullet down is the lead agency cannot delegate responsibility. We talked about that. But you can have your consultant prepare the draft EAF for the lead agency. But again, you have to review it. You can't just rely upon the consultant. Okay, the courts have identified what's called the rule of reason for preparing EAF forms and for basically proceeding in the secret process in general. And that is the EAF must be completed in a reasonable manner, considering the scale and context of the project. The courts have recognized, and DEC recognizes, that most people on local boards are volunteers. They don't have environmental or engineering expertise for the most part, and they're trying to just do the right thing. And as long as you proceed in a reasonable manner, that's going to be okay. But in the end, the courts are going to look at it and say, look at your actions and say, what you did, was it reasonable? Should you have gone farther and looked at something else? And I think when you have consultants that help guide you, it's a lot easier in that process. The other thing is that DEC has rejected the suggestion that the EAF must be prepared by licensed professionals and consultants. Again, the expectation is that the vast majority of the EAF forms are going to be prepared by lay people on the boards who are, again, just trying to do the right thing. Okay, so the EAF is a tool, and it's not an end to itself. And I think the key point here on this slide is that while the EAF is very helpful in helping you sort of determine what the impacts of a project are going to be, if you feel that you need more information, a study of some kind, or you want to have a question answered that's not in the EAF, you have to ask for it. You can't just rely exclusively on the EAF form. And I've seen, and there's been a number of court cases where EAFs were prepared, and the court said you should have gone and asked beyond the EAF and asked for X, Y, or Z study given the type of project. So just keep that in mind. Just completing the EAF doesn't necessarily mean that you've done or taken a hard look at a project. In many instances, that may be the case, but again, you have to sort of have an eye of reason to this and look at it and decide, do I need something more, or is the EAF itself going to be sufficient? Okay, we talked a little bit about the legal risks. I just want to reemphasize this again, and I got some cases to talk about. But failing to adequately and carefully complete the EAF can result in a court annulling the lead agency's approval. And if the lead agency ignores potentially important issues or facts in the EAF, its actions will certainly be annulled in court. And then there was a case in 2000, the Yellow Lantern Campground case. And in that situation, the town board failed to complete Part 3 of the EAF in connection with a zone change. They just completely said, we're not going to do I don't know if they said intentionally they weren't going to do it, but they just didn't do Part 3, and they ended up getting their neg deck annulled. In Kirk Astor Drive Neighborhood Association, that was in 1984. That was a 4th Department, which is an appellate court case. In that situation, a zone change again was annulled when the town board relied on unanswered questions and incomplete information in the EAF. So they did parts 1, 2, and 3, but there were a bunch of questions that they didn't answer. And that's indicative of not taking a hard look when you have an EAF that's half completed or partially completed or erroneously completed. So it is important to try to do the best job you can on that. And then the last two cases are Zambito against the town of Marlborough. This was an Ulster County Supreme Court case in 2003. And in this situation, the board failed to complete parts 2 and 3 of the full EAF, and the court annulled their neg deck and claimed their action was arbitrary and capricious. The last case is Phelps against the town board of the town of Alabama. I actually didn't think there was a town of Alabama in the state of New York, but I guess there is. And in that situation, parts 2 and 3 of the EAF were completed by the applicant. And there was absolutely no evidence in the record that the lead agency had independently assessed the information that the applicant had provided, and the court annulled the decision, and that was the example that I had provided before. So it's clear that the courts are going to be looking very closely at how you prepare the EAF forms, especially in controversial projects. I also wanted you to know that local boards do have the ability to modify EAFs. Local boards do have the legal authority to modify the EAF and sort of create their own EAF if you want to. If you're going to do that, there's certain legal procedures that have to be followed. And a couple of those are the modifications that you make can't be any less protective in the environment than the DEC form. And the scope of the modifications have to be as comprehensive as the DEC form. And then you've got to hold a public hearing to get public input on the modifications that you're proposing, and then you can adopt them. And you got to notify DEC of what those modifications are, and then DEC is going to publish notice of the modifications in their environmental notice bulletin, which is their notification document. Because of the procedures that have to be followed, most boards don't go ahead and modify the EAF form. I have seen it in a handful of situations. I have seen some other state agencies that have modified the EAF forms to suit their own needs, but for the most part, they don't. And it's because it's complicated, and the current forms are very comprehensive, and DEC has done a very good job with the current forms, and most boards just rely upon what DEC has done. Okay, so about a year ago, maybe 2 years ago, DEC started looking at the new, the current forms and deciding whether or not they were going to promulgate some new forms. The full EAF hadn't been substantially modified since 1978. It's a long time. The short EAF had been modified a little bit later than that in 1987, but you're talking decades have passed here between when the forms have been promulgated originally and now, and DEC thought that it was a good time, I think rightfully so, to update them and to provide some new information. There were also, DEC recognized that there are some inadequacies in the short form. It's pretty short, and there were a lot of municipal boards who just weren't using it in projects because it just didn't provide a lot of information, and they were spending a lot of time working on the full form for projects that maybe if they had a short form that had a little bit more information in it, they wouldn't have had to use the full form. And DEC understood that, and so they've tried to streamline it to make things a little bit easier. And the other thing that DEC recognized is that the current forms are not reflective of the issues and questions that routinely arise in the environmental reviews today. And they also don't have new information on current issues that have arisen since the old forms were promulgated, like greenhouse gas emissions and global warming. That's been a very hot topic recently over the last decade or so. And DEC has added questions in the forms to deal with those kinds of issues. They adopted the new short form and the full form back in January of this year, and the new forms are not going to take effect until April 1st of 2013, like I said before. DEC has tried to restructure the forms to make them easier, and I think that they've achieved that in some sense, and in other senses they have not. An example of that is, each one of these new forms is going to have with it an instruction booklet, which is supposed to help the boards answer the questions easier. Unfortunately, the short form instruction booklet or work booklet is about 115 pages long. So I'm not so sure that they achieved the simplification that they were looking for in that regard. But the web-based concept that they've actually brought in, I think, is a very great system that actually will simplify answering a lot of the questions, because you can get on the web in the workbook, and the workbook's got all of these web links, pull-down menus, and other connections to natural resource information and other information on other websites. And we're going to go over that. But it makes it a lot easier for the board to answer the questions because it's right there at their fingertips. So again, I think they achieved some simplification, and on some sense they made it a little bit more complicated. Okay, so we talked about the fact that each EAF is going to have a detailed workbook to provide instructions on completing the forms. We talked about the fact that the short EAF workbook is 115, 112 pages long. DEC did ask for public comments on that. That ended in October. And if you want to take a look at those comments and the responses to them, they're on DEC's website. The new EAFs and the workbooks are going to be available on DEC's website. The workbook for the short form is currently available on DEC's website. As Mark mentioned before, the workbook for the long form is not yet completed. We're hoping that it'll be done within the next couple of months, and that will also be available on DEC's website. Okay. So I'm going to spend some time talking about the new short EAF. I'm going to give you some comparisons to the old form so you can see what the differences are. And here are the comparisons. We'll start out, and I got a number of slides in connection with this. So on the left-hand side is the current, and on the right-hand side is the new. So for the current form, you can use it only for unlisted actions, can't be used for type 1 actions. That's staying the same and hasn't changed. There's a simpler content in questions in the short form than the full. That also hasn't changed. The short form still contains 3 parts. Part 1 provides the basic information about the project, like we talked about. That has not changed. Part 1 has to be completed by the applicant. And as we said, the applicant, if they want, including the boards, can go onto the DEC's website and actually type in the forms and print them out. That has not changed. What has changed, the number of questions that they're asking. The current form has got about 12 questions, very short. If you've ever dealt with it, it truly is a short form. They've covered in the current form 12 topics, which are listed up here. Basically the project description, what land uses are in the vicinity of the project, how much land is going to be affected, whether or not the project complies with zoning, what kind of permits are required, are any existing permits going to have to be modified, that kind of stuff. But then the new form, they basically take the 12 questions from the short and they bump it up and they increase it. And so now there's about 20 new questions in the short form. And they include additional topics such as, are there any critical environmental areas nearby? What's the traffic impacts going to be? Is there compliance with the state energy code? What the impact's going to be on public and private water supply, historic archaeological resources. They include questions about wetlands, wildlife habitat, threatened and endangered species, floodplains, stormwater discharge, water impoundments. Is the project a solid waste management facility? Is it close to a solid waste management facility? Is the project a hazardous waste site? Is it located next to a hazardous waste site? Is it going to deal with hazardous waste? So there's a lot of new questions in there on a variety of topics in the short form. And the short form, I think, really looks more now like a mini version of the long form is currently. And I think that was basically DEC's goal, and they definitely accomplished it. Some other things in the current form, it has to be signed by the applicant or the sponsor when they complete Part 1. There's no change. The new form is also going to require that. In Part 2, the old form provided an impact assessment to determine the adverse impacts. Again, there's not going to be any change to that. Part 2's got to be completed by the lead agency. No change to that either. And then the big change is actually in Part 2. The old form asked 5 questions to help assess what the impacts would be. And the new form asks 11 questions. So it doubles, more than doubles the questions. And the questions that they ask are basically, is there going to be material conflict with the land use plans or zoning regulations? Is there a change in the use or intensity? Is there going to be an impairment to community character? And very similar questions to the factual questions that were asked in Part 1. Again, it's impacts to CEAs, change in traffic, increase or decrease in energy usage, impacts to the public and private water supply systems, any adverse change to natural resources, erosion, flooding, stormwater, those kinds of things, hazards to human health and the environment. And then the new form, short form, then has a bunch of questions which the lead agency has to address and assess, and they basically check a box. After you read the question, is this project going to have a traffic impact? To the right of that are 2 columns. One column says no or small impact may occur, and the next column says moderate to large impact may occur, and you've got to check each one of those boxes. Very similar to the way the long form is currently. So again, they're trying to make the short form a mini version of the long form. Part 3 of the old form, determine your significance in writing. There's going to be no change to that. DEC is allowing you to fully complete the EAF form and at the end be able to check the box and say, this form acts as my support for issuing a negative declaration or requiring a positive declaration in a draft environmental impact statement. Now, one of the things they did eliminate in the short form was in Part 3 of the current form. You had to go through and you had to identify, well, for each impact identified in Part 2 as being important, you had to take a look at whether it was substantial, large, important, or otherwise significant, and the DEC basically eliminated that in the new form. But what they did was they added a new topic, and basically for that new topic is for each impact identified as moderate to large, that's the boxes that you're checking on the right-hand side of the form, you have to explain why the impact may or may not result in a significant adverse impact. You've got to identify the impact, including any mitigation measures or design elements in the project that avoid or reduce the impact. And then you got to explain how the lead agency determined that the impact may or may not be significant. So you can see from this what DEC is trying to get the local boards to do, which is to provide a more reasoned elaboration in Part 3 of the short form as to how you came to your conclusion. So they want you to put more thought into it. They're going to give you more questions to sort of answer and give you more room to sort of write down what the reasons were for coming to the conclusion that you ultimately made. The old form in Part 3 basically had a requirement that each impact must be assessed in connection with its setting, probability of occurring, the duration, irreversibility, geographic scope, and magnitude. And the new forms don't change that analysis at all, but they actually add one element, which is they add, you have to consider the potential short-term, long-term, and cumulative impacts of the project. Okay, then the current form, basically in Part 3, if Part 3 identified one or more potentially large or significant adverse impacts, what the old form required you to do was to then go and use the full EAF to evaluate those impacts further and or prepare a positive declaration. And DEC said, we don't want you to, after you've gone through all this answered all these questions and gone through all this analysis in the EAF form, we're not going to make you go, in the short form, make you go over to the long form and complete that. So they eliminated that. But what they did keep is, if your analysis shows that there's going to be a potentially larger significant adverse impact, you have to prepare a POS deck, and that's what the secret regulations require anyway. And then a couple of the housekeeping requirements in the current form. As you know, it must be signed by the responsible officer of the lead agency. This is either the board chairperson or the deputy chairperson. Typically, there's no change in that in the new form. They still require that. The current form requires a signature by any person who prepared the EAF if it's different than the responsible officer. So if you had your planning consultant or your professional planner in your municipality prepare it, they would also have to sign it. Again, there's no change in that. There's the same requirement. The current form has a section that says if there's any supporting documentation that you need, feel free to add it to the EAF, attach it to the EAF to bolster your assessment. And those studies could be, traffic studies, wetlands, archaeology, lots of other things. The new form doesn't change that. They also allow for that to occur. Okay, so quickly on the short form EAF workbook. So the workbook starts out when you first classify the action, and then it basically ends when you determine whether or not it ends when you issue your determination of significance, whether it's a POS deck or a neg deck. So it tries to cover the entire period of when you would actually be using the EAF forms. Now the workbook contains a number of things. It contains instructions on how to answer the questions in the short EAF. It contains background about each of the questions. It has a glossary, so if you don't know what certain terms mean in the short form EAF, you can go and get a definition in the glossary. And then it also has these web links to spatial data maps and illustrations, which I had mentioned briefly before. And I wanted to run through some of what those web links are to give you a sense as to how comprehensive the workbook is and what kind of materials DEC is putting at your fingertips to help you address the questions and answer the questions in the EAF form. So some of these web links are to the secret regulations if you need to look them up, to the secret cookbook and the handbook, which is in draft form on DEC's website. They send you to Google Earth if you want to take a look at the site from above, or if you need to measure out how far away the site is from, say, a historic resource or from a wetland, you can do that on Google Earth. They send you to the list of DEC's critical environmental areas. They also send you to the Institute of Transportation Engineers, ITE, which contains a whole host of information about traffic. So if you have a project with a lot of traffic impacts, the likelihood is you're going to have an engineer take a look at the traffic impacts. But if you want to learn more about traffic and traffic impact assessment, you can go to the ITE website. The workbook also takes you to the Energy Conservation Construction Code, the Climate Smart Community site. It takes you to the U.S. Green Building Council's LEED site, if you've got any issues with respect to energy efficiency on buildings. It also has web links to the DOH Drinking Water Protection Program, the Well Water Information Program from DOH, and then historic information for the National Register of Historic Places. You can go to the SHPO's website and you can get the Archaeological Sensitive Area map to see whether or not your project's in a sensitive area. And it has access to the Historic Information Network, which gives you a lot of information about historic resources right around the project site. It also takes you to the DEC Resource Mapper, which is a unique web product, which you've ever seen it. You get on DEC's website, and you can actually go right into the project area, and it shows you on your site whether or not there are wetlands, and what are they classified, what are they designated, what are the streams that may be running through there, are the streams classified. It shows any sensitive environmental habitat that DEC has identified on or near the project site. And there's also web links to the Army Corps and their National Wetland Inventory Mapper, so you can see whether or not there are any federal wetlands on the site. And it gives you information about the Army Corps' Federal Wetlands Program. And then it also takes you to DEC Nature Explorer, which has got a whole lot of information about birds, reptiles, amphibians, rare animals, rare plants, and significant natural communities if you got any concerns about those in your project. And continuing on, as you can see, it's fairly comprehensive, but it's also very unique to have all this right at your fingertips when going through an EAF form. But they've got access to the DEC Threatened and Endangered Species list. You can go to FEMA's flood mapper if you have any questions about whether or not it's in a floodplain. You can go to DEC Stormwater Mapper, a lot of mappers here, which shows whether or not the project is in an MS4 community. Most municipalities that are MS4 communities know it, and they know that they have to deal with this issue for stormwater when a project comes in. But for some municipalities, it's helpful to at least be able to go to the map. And this also takes you to the DEC Environmental Site Remediation Database. You can determine whether or not the site is listed as an active or inactive hazardous waste site, whether it's next to one, whether there's one that's in close proximity. So those are, pretty quickly all of the web-based links that DEC gives you in completing the form, and I think it's going to be a very great opportunity for boards. I think it's really going to inform the environmental review process, and it's going to be interesting to see how boards find that as they start working through it. And the only way to tell whether it's going to be a positive and productive change is to let the boards work through it and see what happens. So that's quickly the new short EAF form. I'm now going to turn it over to Mark, and he's going to talk about the new full form.
Okay. The full form, as Dave said, there's a lot of changes. The basic thrust that we've come to see from DEC and their responses to comments on both of the forms is that what they're trying to do is make the short form more readily usable for a greater variety of projects and unlisted actions, to give the board like a mini EAF, as Dave said, a mini full EAF, to enable them to handle those projects more quickly, more thoroughly, and handle all the relevant environmental issues. On the flip side of that, what they've done with the full environmental assessment form is they've raised the bar, the level of information that is to be provided to the boards. And in a lot of the responses to the comments that were received where they said, oh, these questions are too onerous, it requires too much work, you shouldn't be doing that at this phase, this early phase of the project, the DEC's response was basically twofold. One, we're making the information available through the use of all these links that Dave identified. And in the full form, those links are available for the applicant to go forward and answer all the questions that are being put to it. So that's one. We want more information. And two, they've said point blank that if you can't provide this level of information, it's too early for you to be bringing your project to a board. And one of the main concern they're trying to address there is the delay in projects where someone comes in with a one-page application, the short form, or even a full form that's half filled out, and a site plan, and says, okay, approve my project. And it takes weeks and months of back and forth of getting studies and identifying resources, fleshing out issues, and doing all of those things that stretches out that review process and that developers and property owners get very frustrated about. So DEC is saying, well, one of the best ways to deal with that is to go forward and get as much information as you can relevant to all of these issues and come forward with it at the front. And I have to say, based on what we do in our practice representing clients before boards, that's exactly what we recommend to a client, is get all of that information together, come in with the information, and yes, it costs money to do that. However, if you come forward with the information and you're addressing all those issues up front, you save yourself a lot of time, cost, and money going back and forth trying to get to this point anyway. So that's the summary, basically. What I'm going to do is go through the current full EAF, the basic way it's set up, real briefly, and then we'll talk about the changes with the full EAF, and we'll go from there. So basically, as you all know, the current full EAF is for all Type 1 actions and can be used for unlisted actions. And it contains 3 parts. That doesn't change. Part 1 is where the applicant is to provide objective data and information about the proposed project. Basically, there's 57 questions when you go through all those different subsets and sub-questions in there. The new full EAF contains approximately 80. Part 2 is a series of questions, the current Part 2, that is designed to identify the magnitude of the potential impacts of a project. And that's what the board's supposed to do. Take that part of the EAF and use the information that's provided on the Part 1 and determine, okay, given that information, what kind of impacts are going to occur? Are they small, moderate, large? What are they? So that's the lead agency's responsibility. There's currently 20 questions. The new full EAF contains 18 questions, but there's a lot more sub-questions and requires a lot more reference to the data, the additional data that is to be provided to you by the applicants with that form. And also the form, as we said, you either had a small to moderate impact or a potentially large impact as you went through Part 2 and the columns on the side. And that is going to change a little bit with the new form where there's either no or small impact, is column 1. Column 2 is going to be moderate to large. And similar to the short EAF, instead of going through the herky-jerky, is it large, is it significant, is it important, it's going to basically, if it's moderate or large, explain whether it creates a potentially significant adverse impact or it can be mitigated. So the current Part 3, as we said, is only to be used where there's a potentially large impact that was identified. And then therefore, since you've identified that impact, your analysis has to be in writing and is usually used in Part 3, which is 2 blank pieces of paper that's attached to the form generally. That's very helpful for the boards. Mitigation measures that have to be identified to reduce the impacts down to a smaller moderate level have to be identified and explained in the current form. And that way you can go forward and create a negative declaration. If you can't come to that conclusion that it's been reduced, then you have to go require a draft environmental impact statement to be prepared. To determine the importance of an impact, there's criteria in the regulations that the lead agency must consider. And these are all listed here. It's probability of the impact occurring, the duration and irreversibility of the impact. Can it be controlled? Are there regional consequences? How does this diverge from local needs and goals? And what is the objections to the impact? Is this a controversial action? Is there public controversy associated with the project? And then finishing the analysis in the current form, like we said, if you identify an important impact, which may be significant, and it can't be mitigated, you must prepare an EIS. If it doesn't identify any important impacts, you can prepare a negative declaration. So even if you have a potentially large impact on the current full EAF that's identified, it's not necessarily important, triggering the need for an EIS, an environmental impact statement. That's something to keep in mind, that there's a lot of debate and argument at a board level with an applicant whether a project has, whether it's a potentially large or small to moderate. And that's kind of focusing in the wrong spot. It is what it is, whatever you're classifying it as, but the issue really becomes, is it important and can it be mitigated? And if it is deemed in Part 3 not to be important or it can be mitigated, you write out why that's the case and then you move on and no EIS will be required. So sometimes people get concerned as soon as you say potentially large impact, it means environmental impact statement. That's not the case. So again, the EAF must be signed by the responsible officer of the lead agency. That doesn't change, and also signed by the person preparing it, particularly if it's a consultant or someone else along that way. Or if it's coming from the applicant, they prepare Part 1, but if your consultant's doing it, they should sign it as well. The current visual EAF, as Dave mentioned, it's optional, it's not necessary for all actions, and it's used to assess visual and aesthetic impacts. Those types of projects are involving cell towers, antennas, smokestacks, turbines, things that are going to be seen from a large area. And basically what the visual EAF is trying to do is figure out not what it's going to look like from a home on Jones Road that's near the project. It's, are there any sensitive visual resources around? How is it going to fit in that landscape? How many people are going to see it? And are they going to see it when they're driving, or are they going to see it when they're walking on a trail? Because the impact, because visual impact is a very subjective impact that's different to different people. So if you're out for recreation, and many people who are out for recreation are out enjoying the surroundings and the aesthetics of the area is very important. So seeing a smokestack or a wind turbine or a cell tower could have more impact to that viewer than it does for someone who's on the thruway doing 80 miles an hour. Even though 25,000 people may drive past that cell tower, they don't really care because they're on the thruway and they're trying to get where they're going, and It is what it is. So the EAF, the visual EAF, is trying to assess what type, what quantity of views, what's the nature of the views, and what are the resources that are there. So now, the new full EAF, as Dave mentioned, isn't effective until April. We're hopeful that that date holds. Right now we don't have the workbook. You have a 115-page workbook for a 4-page form. Now the new form is a lot larger. I can't imagine what the workbook's going to be. Maybe it'll be about the same, but I'm not holding my breath. If that's the case and it comes out in the next couple months, I imagine they're also going to have public comment on that and then adopting it in final form. I think also one of the real timing issues is going to be how effective their efforts to have that spatial data available via web links and hyperlinks and the effectiveness of its use. They can't say we're putting it out there and we're requiring you to use it and it doesn't work or it's not available. So those are the kinds of things that could delay the application or the effectiveness of these things, but we'll see what happens. And on another unrelated note, before I forget, there's certain things that weren't done with these forms that were raised in comments, certain types of things that weren't addressed. And what DEC is doing now is they're going through and they're initiating a process for some comprehensive amendments and changes to the seeker regulations themselves. And they've just put out a notice of scoping document for the seeker regulations. So that process is occurring, and I think it's intended to address the deficiencies in the regulations just like they did with the forms. So it'll probably follow along that way. Okay, the new EAF, Part 1, still requires the objective data to be provided by a project sponsor or applicant. And it covers the description of the action, what are they doing, where are they doing it, and what environmental resources are going to be impacted. Then the new form gets into more specific, relevant questions and requires, as we said, more information from the applicant. And again, the whole goal of DEC in this regard is to avoid coming in with the minimal amount and then building it up as you go along. They want you to come in with more information, more data for the board so that you can make a better decision sooner. And they understand that it's a higher burden on an applicant, but basically they're saying if you have a project that requires this level of analysis, you got to provide the information. As we said, there's more comprehensive questions and more detail is required in those answers. They're trying to help, because they're saying we're not requiring and we're rejecting the idea that a professional consultant or engineer must prepare this form. They're trying to make that information more available to the applicant and to the boards. So they're talking about the smart forms. And one of the things, as Dave said, when you go on the DEC website and you're typing that information into the forms and it's a PDF document, the one thing it'll tell you is you can't save it. So you can't save the form to your hard drive, fill it in and save it as project 123, EAF. You have to print it out right then or you lose all the data you just put in, which is seemingly in this day and age a ridiculous thing, which I think we would all agree that it'd be much better to be able to keep it in electronic format. When you need to print it out, you print it out. So that's one of the things they're working on as well. The whole goal is to have better consideration of the environmental consequences of an action and reduce the time for lead agencies, and they feel, as in DEC says, that'll give us better projects. So hopefully it'll be a smooth learning curve. Sections B and C of Part 1 it's a little bit of a change. They've moved things around. So they've said, tell us what your project is, where it is, and what are the resources involved. Now they're saying, okay, right up front, does this fit in your community? Is it consistent with a comprehensive plan? Have you looked at it? Is it consistent with zoning laws? Have you looked at it? And they want to know those kinds of things. Are you in a coastal resource zone? So it's more about what's the setting of the project from a regulatory environment that's putting up front. If you remember in the old form, it was kind of all the way in the back, and it was a little thing of what permits are needed and do you have to change a comprehensive plan or anything like that. So they want to have that right up front so they can understand. And that's consistent also, even though, like for example, hydraulic fracturing, there's a separate EAF that an applicant needs to use for that when they go to DEC. They don't use this one. But it's the same concept. One of the things they want to know is how does that fit with your community? Is that use consistent with your community? And that concept is being brought into this document as well. Then the questions in Section D are going through all the different potential environmental impacts. And what we call it is digging a layer deeper. Instead of saying, if there's on the current form, it says, are there any wetlands identified? And if so, what are they? Or is there a stream nearby? Name the stream, that kind of thing. These are going to a different layer. and they're asking for more information about where is that stream, how is it relevant, is there going to be a discharge, things of that nature. So we'll walk through some of those right now, and then we'll get onto more general issues again. So basically, they're asking about excavation and dredging, and they want to know, are you doing it? And that gets into, not are you digging a foundation for a house, it's, are you doing like a mining operation? That's what they want to know. That question's relevant there, because they're not interested in what you're going to do with the dirt from a foundation when you dig it out, but they want to know, okay, if you're taking a substantial amount out, and that's the object of this action, where is it going? What are you doing with it? What are you going to, is there dewatering that's going to be necessary? And all of those other issues right up front. There's expanded discussions on the effects on water bodies, as we said, streams and wetlands, and they're very specific about, okay, if this is going to happen, we want to know, what kind of impacts. Is there going to be filling and the disturbance of sediments, things of that nature. Aquatic vegetation, because that can have an impact on the fish in the streams and in the wetland areas. So that's really important information that they want to have. Also, mostly, they also want to know, right up front, tell me how much impact you're going to have. Not tell me you're near a wetland and we're not really sure. We might be near it, we might not. They want to know, if you're near a wetland, how much impact is it going to have? Or if you're near a buffer area, how much impact is it going to have? Again, they keep going. Demand for water. Are you going to need to expand your district, create additional lines? Where is your source of supply? And the idea here is it's a very important issue to know where you're going to get your water from if it's a residential development or an industrial use that has the need for a water supply. That's important information for them to know. The creation of liquid waste. They ask for more detailed information on the nature of what it is and how it's going to be handled, instead of letting it be fleshed out by the boards. It's right up front, and they want the applicant to give that information. Traffic, a lot more specific questions as to the trips, peak periods, all the things that are kind of usually saved and not addressed unless a traffic study is requested or required. So these kind of questions are fleshing that out to enable the boards to determine whether or not they want to have a report to address the issues that are raised, or they may say, I have enough information here upon which to make my determination. Energy use is a more detailed questions now, instead of just saying, do you need more? They're going to ask, where are you going to get it? And where are you going to fix, are you going to use an existing substation, or do you have to improve it? Stormwater is basically, the difference is, stormwater permits are DEC general permits. Now they're saying you need to tell the local board whether or not you're going to need, what kind of information relevant to that would determine whether or not a speedies permit is needed, the general permit is needed. So it's a lot more information, where before it was kind of like, well, that's not the local board's realm. Yes, it's a permit that's needed, but it's outside your jurisdiction. Now they're making the applicant give you the information to understand what that impact may be. Air emissions, the questions are very specific. Is a permit required? And if so, what are your emissions? Tell us. What types of emissions, how much? All of that has to be in there, right in the EAF instead of in a report later. Methane, whether any will be generated, and we put in a couple tongue-in-cheek questions regarding, if there's solid waste and sewage, that we'll have to calculate the metric tons per year of methane. Also, whether cattle and sheep that put methane in the air in other ways will also have to be calculated. Other parts that are important that come out more in projects requiring an EIS are construction hours and noise. Basically, the effects of a project's construction on the local community. And they want to have a lot more information there, particularly ambient noise levels and noise to be generated during construction. And that's very important, and it's been very important in particular types of projects. But now I think they're recognizing that this is, there's more development going on in developed areas, and that's an important issue for residents across the state. Outdoor lighting, again, that's something that has always been these are site plan type questions that boards see frequently, but now they're being forced to be put right in the EAF. So if you have lighting on your plan, you're going to have to explain it here in the EAF. Questions regarding storage of petroleum, use of recycled materials and how much, hazardous waste questions, again, all of those things are going to be continued, and more questions done. Okay, new issues that are being asked are basically in Section E regarding the site and setting of your proposed action. Does the facility serve children, elderly, or people with disabilities, or is it within a site that does that? Is it within 1,500 feet of a facility that does that? They want to know that because that's a quality of life issue. Questions regarding dams. And in fact, DEC was requiring you to say, is there a dam on site or is there a dam in the region area near you? And they removed the off-site dam questions, and they've kept, does the site contain a dam? And if so, what's the status of the dam? And I think these are kind of things that come out of, Hurricane Irene, disasters like that, where these resources might not have been relevant. You might have a dam on site and you're putting a building over here, who cares? But now they want to know, is that there? Has it been looked at? What's going to happen? Because if there is a disaster, is it going to be, adequately cared for or looked at so that it won't be a disaster? Is the site, has it been used as, or is it next to a solid waste management facility? And also requires a mini phase 1 environmental site assessment. Look at the spills database and tell us what you find. That's nowhere in the current forms. Also, institutional and engineering controls, land use limitations, environmental easements, and cleanup remediation plans have to be identified. That's really important, to understand, if particularly on a brownfield site. A lot of times there's environmental easements out there that say this site can only be used for this classification of project, and what they're saying is you need to tell us that right up front, because it could be a non-starter. Instead of trying to get things changed, we figured it out. They want to know right up front, and if there's a remediation plan, they want to know if your project's consistent with that and how to go forward. They also have floodplain issues that they want you to look at, and whether you're in a 500-year floodplain and also predominant wildlife species. Okay, so then basically the next section is E3, and they want to know, are there public resources on or near your site? And that's, again, now you're going to start bringing in questions from the visual EAF and things like that. And the first category is there a significant natural community? What types of trees? What types of plants? Is there something significant that the state wants to protect? There are a bunch of concerns with the EAF that even though they've made great efforts to move forward and raise the bar for information for the full EAF, basically it's still oriented towards a project on a specific site on a certain number of acres, and all the questions are geared around that. The DEC acknowledges that they've had a very hard time trying to create a document to be used when there's planning activities, comprehensive plans, zoning laws, things like that are being adopted, because the questions and the environmental impacts are so site-specific in the forms, but they're hoping to address that through rulemaking and being able to deal with it in that regard. One of the other comments that was frequently repeated with the forms is that the level of detail was too onerous for smaller type 1 actions, particularly one that might be like a cell tower. It's only type 1 because it's taller than 100 feet. So now you're 100 feet and you've got to put in all this relevant information when we're talking about a 10,000 square foot area of land that's being affected. So it seems out of whack, but again, DEC is hoping to address that during some of the rulemaking that's going to occur, and how they treat, or whether they trigger a type 1 review with that 100-foot limitation. So, and the other concern was that there's increased risk of litigation and exposure to boards and applicants as you're learning to use these forms with all this detailed information, where you as a board and the applicant may agree this isn't relevant to us. And if that's not adequate, so then you skip a question and you go on. Now that creates a hole in the EAF. So the answer is going to be either answer the question or state this isn't relevant to our project because, and then answer it that way. So that way you can show that you looked at it, you didn't ignore it. And again, the standard isn't that you looked at each and every single environmental impact that's out there. You have to look at all of the relevant environmental impacts. And if you excluded one, the court's going to look at whether or not that was reasonable that you did that. So if you say, I did it because there's no such resources involved in this project, and we looked at this mapping and that mapping and period, then it's a reasonable, in my opinion, a reasonable step to then go and move on to the next question. Issues that DEC is leaving to address in the workbook. And again, this kind of goes into how big is the workbook going to be. And it also does beg the question of, why do you need a huge workbook if you're revising the forms? What's going on here? Is it really the way to go? But That's the way they're doing it. First is they're going to have some definitions. They're going to give further detail and explanations of the questions and guidance on, and this is interesting, guidance on what is a good project description. And I find that to be a relatively interesting one because that's usually the domain of the applicant, and then it's the nature of the description of the project is brought out through the other information, but we'll see how that goes. They're also talking about having, showing you what to attach to this form. Site plans, any reports that are submitted or prepared, what copies of the mapping resources and things that you utilized, anything of that nature to be attached to it. They're going to have discussions of how to use this form in a planning or zoning law or zone change analysis context. So they say, we get it, we understand this doesn't work great for a zoning law type situation, adoption, but we're going to give you some guidance on how to make it as good as it could be. Also, they're talking about discussion of green infrastructure and bringing that into a project and what that means in the environmental analysis. Part 2 is still the part of the document where you're going to look at all the information provided by the applicant. By the way, you should have a copy of the full EAF that was given as a handout. If you don't, please be sure to see us and we'll make sure you get one. Part 2 is still for you to use to quantify the magnitude of your potential impacts, and then again, quantification of the impact is different than a determination of significance. You're figuring out, is there an impact? If so, is it small, or is it moderate, or is it large? Again, as we said, the old form was small or moderate and then moved to potentially large. They've now changed it and eliminated the small to moderate category. They've changed it so that it's no impact or small impact category 1, and then moderate to large impact category 2. And so we've talked about that. Okay, before, if an impact threshold was met, you had to check potentially large impact. Again, as we said, that created a lot of disputes or arguments and discussion at board level whether or not that was a potentially large impact would trigger the need for an EIS, but there is another step of the analysis that needs to be done. Now you either have no or a small impact, and if not, it's moderate to large, and DEC wants it to be more user-friendly, so each Part 2 question is keyed to the corresponding Part 1 information to be provided. So they're given, and it's listed right on the form. In Part 2, Question 1, go see Part 1, Section E2, whatever it might be. Okay, all impacts of the project should be considered. The list of impacts on the form are not exhaustive. If there's a section for other impacts, and if there's other things that you identify, or the applicant gives you information that it identifies an impact, you can use that section to identify it, analyze it, and move forward. Again, as Dave said, the lead agency needs to independently assess the form and the information, and that's really important. And you'll see in a lot of resolutions where it says, we received an application, they provided this information, and it's listed out, and then it says, we received a recommendation from our consultant that it was there are no potential significant environmental impacts and a negative declaration should be prepared. We find it very important to then go on and say, and the board then looked at all of this information, including the recommendation of its consultant, and independently came to this conclusion, da 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 da. And that's really important, showing that you took the information, including that from your consultant, and acted on it. So also, as we said, moving on, that the EAF is now brought into Part 2. The visual EAF questions are brought into Part 2. And then Part 3, an analysis in a written narrative form for each of the potentially moderate to large impacts. And that's where you go through with the seeker regs and determining the criteria of significance, and you go through and decide, okay, is this impact that we've identified as moderate to large, potentially significant, or can it be mitigated or avoided? So that's that, and then you have to write out all that reasoning, and that's the basis for your decision. And then at the end of the document, which I think is also a lot more logical, that's where they have the part where you make your determination of significance instead of right on the cover of the old full EAF, which I always thought was a little backwards because it tempted people right off the bat just to, do it, I'm done, I've seen the information, move on. And that, again, just creates exposure for you and for the boards. So from this point forward, we'd like to take some questions, anything you have, and thank you very much for your attention today.